means that the needle does not collect the yarn and no loop is formed at all, and this is shown on the left hand side. This misknit results in a float stitch at the back of the fabric. Here you can see brown floating at the extreme edges and grey in the middle. If we look at the front, then we see the reverse, grey knitted at the edges and brown knitted in the middle. Alternatively, a different effect can be produced by tucking, as seen on the right, where the yarn is taken into the hook of the needle, but the loop is not fully formed. And here's an example of a tucked fabric. The two remaining variations in the machine knitter's operation are the transfer stitch on the left and the spread stitch. Here we have an example of a transfer stitch, and this is a spread stitch. They're commonly used in ladies' and men's underwear respectively. Perhaps the easiest way to get to grips with the variations is to show them on our simple circular machine. First is the misknit, where the needle does not rise to pick up the yarn, giving a float stitch at the back of the fabric. Second, the tuck stitch, where the needle is lifted and it is not taken down to knit. Note that I've rotated the machine 3 times before returning to full loop formation. This gives an additional option to the designer. Third is the transfer stitch, where a loop is taken from one needle and placed over one alongside. Fourth is the spread stitch. The first part is where a loop is spread over an adjacent needle as well as its own. And the second is a double spread, where the loop is spread not only over its own needle, but over needles on each side of it. So far we have dealt with knitting on machines that have one set of needles, like the domestic machine and the simple hand-turned circular machine. Such machines are said to have one needle bed and can only produce the basic plain knitter structures with the variations of the float, tuck, transfer and spread stitches. As we operate this hand flat machine, you can see the needles rising and falling from a single bed. In fact, this machine has 2 needle beds, inclined to one another like an inverted V. If the second bed is put into operation, you can see a second set of needles rising and falling, slotting alternately with each other. Let's look at this hand-flat V-bed machine a little closer. Each needle is contained in a slot or a trick. The 2 beds are arranged so that the tricks in each bed alternate with each other. This allows needles to be lifted into the knitting position without crashing into each other. This arrangement of tricks is called rib gating, and the fabric produced by such a needle arrangement is called 1x1 rib, since in one course there is one loop knitted on one bed followed by a loop on the other bed. Such a fabric has the same appearance on each side, and because of the strains developed in the yarn, the fabric has a greater width extension than plain knitted fabric. The introduction of the second bed allows a further increase in the variety of structures, since most of the variations in loop formation can also be achieved on rib fabrics. We can see that needles can be arranged in different ways. It is not necessary to have a needle in every trick. Here we have each needle knitting producing a 1x1 rib. But for example, by arranging a sequence of two knitting needles and two knitting needles and two spaces in each bed, but staggered with respect to each other, we arrive at a 2x2 rib. You can see by choosing which tricks have needles in and which remain empty, a variety of rib structures can be achieved. The 2x2 rib is a common one for use on waists and cuffs of knitted outerwear. You remember that we have seen 3 latch needles of different sizes before. You will now know that these needles will require different width tricks in which to fit. The number of tricks per inch of needle bed is called a machine gauge, but being textiles there is an exception, of course, which we'll deal with later. The finer the needle, the finer the yarn needed to knit successfully. For example, stockings are knitted on machines of about 36 gauge. And a coarse gauge outerwear like this will be knitted on a 3 to 5 gauge machine. In this program we have looked at the basics of knitting and the building blocks of knitting stitches. In the next program we shall deal with some commercial knitting machines and with the products produced from them.